Great. So we might get started again. So our next talk will be by Professor Paul Blackledge. He's Professor of Ethics at Shanxi University. He's published many articles on Marxism and on Alasdair MacIntyre's relationship to Marxism in particular. He's co-editor of several collections, including Alasdair MacIntyre's engagement with Marxism, selected writings 1953 to 1974, which will be many of us have come to terms with. MacIntyre's engagement, his writing with Marxism, very well edited collection with the late Neil Davidson, and also a collection of essays, critical essays, edited with Kelvin Knight, called Virtue and Politics. His monographs include Marxism and Ethics, which has a convincing final chapter dealing with Alasdair MacIntyre's work, and most recently, Paul published Friedrich Engels and Modern Social and Political Theory. His talk today is called Under the Shadow of Hegel, Alasdair MacIntyre's Concept of Practice. So welcome, Paul, to speak. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Good. Right. So my starting point is obviously to thank everyone for the invitation, to apologise for my seating position in the living room. While the last speaker was on, my internet was playing up in my office, so you get to see, there we go, the view in sunny Leeds on a cold day. We're living in interesting times, I guess. Our buffoonery of the British government at the moment is, amongst other people, it's attacking us something they're calling social Marxists. I think they mean cultural Marxists. I never really knew what a cultural Marxist was, you know, other than a mode of abuse by right-wing politicians. We've now got social Marxists because I don't think they know what a cultural Marxist is either. Anyway, such is life. Okay. Kelvin Knight has suggested that Hegel was, for some time after the publication of After Virtue, the elephant in MacIntyre's room. The reasoning behind this claim is obvious enough. MacIntyre's long history of ethics is in many ways a homage to Hegel's historicisation of the subject, while his insistence on the importance of teleology and tradition to the formation and reproduction of the virtues, as at the very least a strong familial resemblance to Hegelian ethics. More to the point, for many years prior to the publication of After Virtue, MacIntyre repeatedly referenced Hegel, or at least Hegel is seen through the lens of the young Marx, as a powerful influence on his own work. Indeed, so powerful was this mediation of Hegelianism that it's perhaps not unreasonable to suggest we might modify Knight's claim to propose that a Hegelian Marx is the real elephant in MacIntyre's room. The claim that Marx continues to influence MacIntyre's mature thought is less contentious than it used to be. Whereas After Virtue was once widely interpreted as a conservative and communitarian work, MacIntyre's criticisms of communitarianism and the character of the conservative moralist, alongside his positive endorsement of Marx's critical analyses of capitalism and the state, have made his reading of his work, somewhat redundant. Nonetheless, he remains a somewhat distance from Marxism for reasons that relate in part to his understanding of Marx's Hegelianism. MacIntyre's mature understanding of this relationship is interesting because for a short period around the turn of the 1960s, he interpreted Marx as an Hegelian whose thought escaped the limitations of the orthodox interpretation of his work that was accepted at the time on both sides of the Iron Curtain. This contribution to New Left debates was, as E.P. Thompson insisted, of the first importance to the project of steering a socialist course, independent of both social democracy and Stalinism. Conversely, if persuasive, his mature criticisms of Marx signal the failure of this New Left project. Indeed, MacIntyre has come to argue that Marx, while broadly correct in his understanding of the dialectical conflict between wage labour and capital, misunderstood the ethical implications of this relationship. What Marx took to be true in essence of the new proletariat was in fact a fleeting characteristic of an age that ended just prior to the publication of the Communist Manifesto. Marx's hour of Minerva had flown, but he had mistaken dusk for dawn. In the thesis on Feuerbach, Road Not Taken, published in 1994, MacIntyre argues that the collapse of communism went hand in hand with the emergence of, on the one hand, a host of groups in the old Eastern Bloc who struggled to reattain the standpoint of civil society, while on the other hand, in the West, politics either asserted or presupposed the limiting parameters of this perspective. This standpoint is of the first importance to ethical theory because social relations within civil society are effectively external relations between monads whose interactions are reduced effectively to contractual relations between individuals who have become but the means to each other's ends. It is from the need to limit the war of all against all implied by this form of social interaction that modern legal and moral norms and state powers emerged. Conversely, socialism, at least Marx's variant of socialism, implies that this situation might be overcome such that human interactions come to be understood as something like, as Marx wrote in the manifesto, an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. This vision of socialism rested upon a critique of the standpoint of civil society that Marx worked out to his own satisfaction in the early mid-1840s. And it's MacIntyre's claim that though Marx believed that he'd solved the problems through the famous process of self-clarification that he talked about in the 1859 preface, as he and Engels penned the manuscripts that have subsequently been published as the German ideology, the task was only half complete when they famously left the manuscripts to the gnawing criticism of the mice. Consequently, MacIntyre argues that historical materialism, as Engels was to call the framework first outlined in these manuscripts, is to be judged a failure, and Marxism as a movement, far from pointing beyond the limitations of the standpoint of civil society, has reproduced these failings in its own debased practice. Interestingly, MacIntyre outlined this argument most forcefully, not through a detailed interrogation of the manuscripts of what's become known as the German ideology, but rather through the medium of a critique of the 2 pages of Marx's dense and brilliant thesis on Feuerbach. The reasoning behind this approach is not at all obvious, though justly famous. Especially the last thesis is claimed that whereas the philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways, the point is to change it. These lines, these theses are not at all transparent. To take, for instance, the 6th thesis is famous claim that the essence of man is no abstraction inherent in each individual. In reality, it is an ensemble of social relations. Although this statement has often been read as sure proof that Marx dismissed the concept of human nature, Norman Gerrers has convincingly shown that Marx, in fact, merely rejected Feuerbach's tendency to confuse human nature with one of its many manifestations. Thus, he famously criticised Feuerbach for substituting in the essence of Christianity historically concrete men with abstract generic man. He claimed that because Feuerbach abstracted man from this real historical process in this way, he ironically assumed exactly that which he must prove, namely that contemporary form of behavior was universal. Marx repeated a similar argument 2 decades later when in Capital he criticised Bentham's naivety for assuming that modern petty bourgeois, especially the English petty bourgeois, is the normal man. Against this method, he argued that any analysis of human nature would first have to deal with human nature in general and then with human nature as historically modified in each epoch. Commenting on these lines, Erich Fromm points out that Marx was never tempted to assume that human nature was identical with the particular expressions of human nature prevalent in his own society, because he was able to distinguish the essence of man from the various forms of existence. These comments on just one of the theses on Feuerbach evidence the inherent problems associated with attempts to read this document, or indeed any of Marx's unpublished in his lifetime's works, as if they were finished products of his considered thoughts on specific subjects. Indeed, the theses of Feuerbach are best understood as notes to self that condensed some of the arguments elaborated at greater length, though not to the point of publication, in the German ideology manuscript. And although they were published by Engels after Marx's death to support his own interpretation of the birth of their joint framework, this provenance merely points to the fact that they demand to be interpreted in the context of Marx's and Engels's broader works. This is especially true of Marx's works of the mid-1840s, when his thought was in a process of profound theoretical development and deepening. For instance, while the Feuerbach chapter in the German ideology manuscript dovetails with the account of historical materialism presented in the 1859 preface, it is important to register that Marx had yet to articulate his key concept of relations of production as one of the key terms in his theory of revolution. Nevertheless, MacIntyre interprets these theses as the key to understanding Marxism's failure as an emancipatory political project. He argues that within them, Marx can be understood as claiming that a standpoint of civil society could be transcended through a particular form of practice, that the only theory capable of conceptualizing this critique must be rooted in this form of practice, that the understanding must be orientated to a certain telos, and that this telos is a form of objective activity in which goals are met cooperatively in a way that is distinct from the common goals known to civil society. Whereas these goals within civil society are reducible to the goals of a collection of individuals, the universal goals of this new form of practice emerges independently of the particular goals and desires of these individuals. Indeed, through engaging with these practices, these individuals not only aim at changing the world, but do so by changing themselves. Against this framework, MacIntyre posits two possible objections. First, that Marx failed to articulate the Aristotelian coordinates that were tacit to his argument. However, whereas he had previously strongly criticized Marx for this failure, by the 1990s, he had accepted that the growing literature that had made explicit the Aristotelian coordinates of Marx's social theory. Second, he argues that Marx requires a more detailed engagement with Hegel and Feuerbach if his criticisms of their interpretation of civil society are to succeed. It's at this level that Marx's arguments fail, or so MacIntyre claims. Against the young Hegelians, Marx was right to insist on the impotence of political strategies that merely reveal the incoherence of their opponents' arguments, and that practical social movements are a prerequisite for social change. However, MacIntyre argues that Marx attempted to theorize this form of practice must be judged a failure. Following Feuerbach, Marx recognized the social and material roots of ideology. The Holy Family is but a reified reflection of human relations. However, if arguments of this type are true, the problem arises of how the kind of egoistic individualism characteristic of civil society is able to underpin the emergence of an ethical alternative to modern moral and legal theory. MacIntyre argues that Marx failed to adequately answer this question. If this theoretical failure meant Marx was too quick to assume he had done the groundwork necessary to move on to construct his critique of political economy, this failing had empirical political roots in his misunderstanding of earlier workers' movements against capitalism. The early 19th century handloom weavers of Lancashire and Yorkshire, alongside similar groups in Silesia, exhibited forms of collective militancy in defense of their mode of life that saw them reject the ideologies of those who spoke from the standpoint of civil society. Unfortunately, as so MacIntyre claims, Marx misunderstood these forms of militancy as precursors to the future of the proletariat rather than expressions of a specific and historically fleeting form of social life. In fact, far from reproducing similar forms of struggles, proletarianization destroys these forms of life through which the goods internal to them can emerge as the basis for an alternative to capitalist civil society. It tends to deprive workers, also MacIntyre writes, of those forms of practice through which they can discover conceptions of a good and virtuous and of virtues adequate to the moral needs of resistance. So while workers may have embodied in their practice a revolutionary ethics of emancipation at certain moments in history, the process of proletarianization confounded Marx's hope for the working class by simultaneously making resistance a necessary part of their lives, alongside robbing this resistance of its emancipatory potential. One consequence of this situation, as so MacIntyre believes, is that Marxism has become utopian in the traditional unworldly sense of the term. Marxism is therefore at best another moral framework in a sea of competing moral frameworks that counterpose abstract conceptions of the common good to the concrete asocial sociality of civil society. This characteristic of Marxist theory informed two distinct tendencies within Marxism. As a non-solution to the unbridgeable gulf between the real working class and the abstract idealized image of this class as it exists within Marxist theory, Marxism has produced its own version of the Übermensch, Lukács's ideal proletarian or Lenin's ideal revolutionary. Conversely, when nominally Marxist parties win or seriously challenge for power, even when led by well-meaning individuals, they tend to produce all the failings of mainstream capitalist parties because they are not rooted in the kind of real movement which abolishes the present state of things, as Marx and Engels wrote in the German ideology. Indeed, because no such movement exists, as Marxists organize and move toward power, as MacIntyre famously wrote in After Virtue, they have become Weberians in substance, even if they remain Marxists in rhetoric. Interestingly, this argument amounts to an imminent critique of Marx. For one insight from Marx, which has been a constant source of inspiration for MacIntyre throughout the ups and downs of his theoretical journey since the 1950s, has been the third thesis on Feuerbach, in which Marx famously wrote that the materialist doctrine that men are products of circumstances and upbringing, and that therefore changed men are products of other circumstances and changed upbringing, forgets that it is men that change circumstances, and the educator must himself be educated. And then goes on to talk about the coincidence of changing of circumstances and human activity. It must be understood as revolutionary practice. Commenting on these lines in a programme originally broadcast by the BBC in 1960, MacIntyre wrote, Marx attacks here one of the doctrines dominant in Europe since the 18th century. According to this doctrine, there are objective causal laws, both of nature and of history, knowledge of which enables men to control their own destiny. So far as social life is concerned, the manipulation of society is possible to those who possess the secret of these laws. As Marx saw it, this doctrine implies the sharpest division in society between those who know and those who do not, the manipulators and the manipulated. Classical Marxism stands in stark contrast to this, he argued in 1960. It wants to transform the vast mass of mankind from victim and puppets into agents who are masters of their own lives. But Stalinism treated Marxist theory as the discovery of the objective and unchangeable laws of history, and glorified the party bureaucrats as the men who possessed the knowledge which enabled and entitled them to manipulate the rest of mankind. What MacIntyre wrote of Stalinism in 1960, he later extended both to bureaucratic managers and to the classical Marxists more generally who preceded Stalin. He also argued that Marx's economic predictions had been found wanting by the test of history, and that the working class had failed to become the self-conscious revolutionary agency envisaged by Marx. Marx in his maturity had lost sight of how politics and ideology could fundamentally affect economics because he had become hamstrung by his use of the base and superstructure metaphor, according to which, as so MacIntyre claimed in 1968, these two elements of the social totality stand in external contingent causal relationship to each other. Repeating this claim in 1995, he suggested that this reified way of conceptualizing the relationship between politics, economics, ideology, and so forth reflected the extent to which Marxist thought was distorted in a characteristically bourgeois manner. Marxism was thus a product of its time, and this was its undoing. For while Marx attempted to theorize praxis, His development of the base superstructure metaphor saw him revert back towards a crude mechanical materialism. This partly explained why Marxism failed to become the theoretical expression of the real workers' movement in struggle to become instead a pseudo-science of self-appointed leaders of the workers' movement whose claims to understand the iron law of history were but mask for another incommensurable moral framework in a world where ethical positions generally have become more or less coherent expressions for personal preferences. Interestingly, MacIntyre made this argument more or less in 1953. Marxism and Interpretation is a remarkable book, not simply because MacIntyre was only 22 when he wrote it, and what he wrote is full of insight and evidence of a keen understanding of a wide swathe of Marx's and Engels' works, but also because in many ways it prefigures his mature, respectful critique of Marxism. According to MacIntyre in 1953, Marx's tragedy consisted in his misplaced hope of assigning to his social theory the certainty of natural sciences. This project meant that his many insights were reduced to a system that amounted to a form of human alienation that was simply too abstract to understand real human history. Ironically, Marx reproduced errors for which he had chastised Hegel. Both undermined their histories by replacing the history of real men and women with the mythologized history of abstractions. This was particularly problematic for Marx, whose conception of revolutionary practice as the coincidence of changing ourselves while we change the world demanded a moral component that his scientific standpoint forced him to dismiss. By talking of what is rather than what ought to be, Marx produced an incoherent philosophy of action. Thus argued MacIntyre in his early 20s. This incoherent project informed incoherent politics. Again, making the point that he's later to repeat that such that you've got people like Plekhanov on the one hand insisting that a mechanical view of history, according to which history is made by the masses, while Lenin counters in a much more humanistic register that conscious leadership was necessary for the victory of revolution. If Trotsky in 1904 and MacIntyre in his early 20s had read Trotsky's 1904 article on substitutionism, predicted the unfortunate outcome of Lenin's form of substitutionalism, the truth is that history is made in part by leaders, as Trotsky subsequently recognized and as MacIntyre noted in his brilliant review of Deutsch's biography of Trotsky. If both Plekhanov and Lenin could draw inspiration from Marx, the truth is, he argued in 53, is this illuminated the incoherence of the original doctrine. What's interesting about MacIntyre's theoretical and political evolution, to me at least, and to Neil Davidson before his untimely death 2 years ago, is that shortly after publishing this essay, he made a brilliant contribution to New Left debates on socialist humanism that sought to untangle Marx and Lenin. Very interesting, given the context then and now, from the charge of incoherence. In his key contribution to the New Left debates of the 1950s, Notes from the Moral Wilderness, MacIntyre suggested that Stalin's theory of history could not truthfully be read into either Marx's younger or more mature writings. In place of the orthodox interpretation of historical materialism, MacIntyre insisted that the moral core of Marx's political project was to be retrieved and reconstructed from the fragments that Marx had written on the subject. Then it must be carried out alongside a similar reconstruction of Marx's theory of history. The Stalinists claimed that the course of history was predictable and that the victory of socialism was inevitable rested, or so MacIntyre insisted, by contrast with both his earlier and his late criticisms of Marx, on a distortion of the role of the base superstructure metaphor in Marxist theory. What Marx suggested when he deployed this metaphor was neither a mechanical nor a causal relationship. Rather, terms such as correspond and determine are best understood, he argues, as part of the Hegelian language through which Marx sought to denote a process through which our productive metabolic exchange with nature provides a framework within which superstructures arise, a set of relations around which the human relations can entwine, a kernel of human relationships from which all else grows. E.P. Thompson, in his essays of the early 1970s and his discussions of the New Left in that period, very much kept going back to this idea of kernel and this interpretation of the base and superstructure model as a positive and progressive research paradigm, and really wanting MacIntyre to carry on that project. Thompson was very much in a minority in this period in terms of his interpretation of MacIntyre. Anyway, as against the claim that Marx believed that the reorganization of political superstructures would follow necessarily upon changes in the economic base, MacIntyre insisted that in creating the basis, you create the superstructure. They're not two activities, that they are the one. So this is in contrast both to what he argues in 53 and what he argues in 68 and subsequently. This is a very different Hegelian interpretation of Marxism, and very different from either the voluntarism of traditional interpretations of Lenin's politics and the mechanical materialism of traditional interpretation of Stalinist politics. So against both Stalin and his liberal critics, MacIntyre argued that we should look for an ethical theory which treats what emerges in history as providing us with the basis for our standards without making the historical process morally sovereign or its progress automatic. To this end, he claimed that Marxists should follow Aristotle specifically and the Greeks more generally by linking ethics to human desires. He thus proposed to relate morality to the needs and desires in a way that was radically at odds with Kant. For whereas Kant, the author of morality, is utterly divorced from the ears of desire, MacIntyre followed Marx's critique of Feuerbach to insist that by divorcing ethics from activities which aim to satisfy needs and desires in this way makes it unintelligible as a form of human activity. MacIntyre therefore sought to relate morality to human desires and needs in a way that radically historicized human nature without losing sight. I just lost myself. Without losing sight of its biological basis. The power of Marxist theory of history, or so he claimed in 1958, was rooted in his historicization of the human essence. Contrary to arguments of 1953, in 58, he argued that it was a strength of Marx's work that he juxtaposed to existing social relations, not an abstract utopia, but the real collective movement of workers in struggle through which they realized that solidarity is a fundamental human desire. This model suggests that Marx, through his concept of proletarian self-emancipation, held to precisely the kind of internal teleology that escaped the limitations both of consequentialism and deontology. Marx, according to MacIntyre, understood that the deep historical and sociological content of this question when he suggested that the emergence of human nature is something to be comprehended in terms of the history of class struggle. Specifically, in modern times, the proletariat created objectively through the development of the forces of production could begin in its struggle against capital to match the potential, or so we argued, in its objective structure to create the conditions for the solution to contemporary problems of morality. It begins to embody the practice which could overcome the rift between our conceptions of morality and our conception of desire. By acting in this way, members of the working class could come to realize that solidarity is not simply a useful means through which they struggle to meet their needs, but is in fact what they naturally desire. The political practice of socialists who aim in the first instance to win majorities to the view is rooted in this new needs and desires. So once the political left rid itself of both the myth of the inevitable triumph of socialism and of the reification of socialism of some indefinite end which justifies any action taken in its name, then socialists will truly comprehend the interpenetration of means and ends through the history of class struggle, and will understand Marxist morality to be, as against the Stalinists, an assertion of moral absolutes, and against the liberal critics of Stalin, an assertion of desire and history. Concretely, in Breaking the Chains of Reason in 1960, edited collection by E.P. Thompson for the New Left, and in very Hegelian language, he argues that freedom could not be won by telling the masses what to do, what the elites desire it do, but only by helping them move where they desire. The goal is not happiness or satisfaction, but freedom, and freedom has to be both means and ends. The mechanical separation of means and ends is suitable enough for human manipulation, not human liberation. In Freedom of Revolution, a political essay he wrote at about the same time, he asked how, if freedom cannot be handed to the working class from above, it might be realised from people otherwise crippled by the competitive relations of civil society. MacIntyre answered that socialists must join revolutionary parties whose goal was to act in such a way as to aid the proletariat achieve freedom. The path to freedom must be by means of an organisation which is dedicated not to building freedom, but to moving the working class to build it. And that gives you the need for a vanguard party. Over the next decade, MacIntyre came to believe that he'd been mistaken in arguing that Marxists could escape the charge of incoherence. Either Kautsky or Lukács or both was the graveyard of Marxism. You either deified the party, deified history, or you had an incoherent combination of the two. Became Marx's, the basis for Marx's failure as a systematic anti-capitalist project. So the question is, had MacIntyre lost all sense of perspective in 58 and succumbed to the myth of an ideal proletariat? I think the answer is somewhat more nuanced than this and calls for more of an engagement with Hegel. The truth is, as MacIntyre has recognised on numerous occasions in his mature writings, sometimes the working class movement has acted in an emancipatory manner. For instance, commentating on an article I very much enjoy, commentating on the difference between his post-Marxism and the Frankfurt School, he wrote, "To Adorno, my inclination is to respond by quoting Dr. Johnson's friend, Oliver Edwards, who said that he too had tried to be a philosopher, but cheerfulness was always breaking in. Perhaps a Philistine, but also an appropriate response," MacIntyre wrote. "What grounds then are there for cheerfulness in any social order, such as our own, about which Adorno's central claims hold true? Those grounds derive surely from the continuing resistance to deprivations, frustrations, and evils that inform so many everyday lives in so many parts of the world." These are lines that very much resonate at the moment in terms of especially British politics. To be good, to live rightly, and to think rightly, it may be said in reply to Adorno, is to be engaged in struggles, and a perfected life is one perfected in a key part through struggles. MacIntyre included amongst the struggles through which the good life might be lived the resistance mounted by some rank and file trade union movements. On a similar note, in Dependent Rational Animals, he suggested that 19th and 20th century Welsh mining communities should be numbered amongst those local communities where practices survived in resistance to the market and which were sustained by, amongst other virtues, those of trade union struggles. Unfortunately, these comments on Welsh mining communities are tentative, to say the least. In just a few lines, he writes that these communities were informed by the ethics of work at the coalface, by a passion for the goods of choral singing and of rugby football, and the virtues of trade union struggle against first coal owners and then the state. While empirical studies of the Welsh mining communities cohere with MacIntyre's general comments on these communities as important foci of virtuous resistance to capitalism, the actual content of this resistance tends to challenge the pessimism of his more general analysis of working class life under capitalism. Thus, in the classic account of the South Wales Miners' Federation, the Fed, Ewell Francis and Di Smith point to the intimate links between trade union struggles and the sustenance of these local communities. They argued that it was primarily through the trade union that such communities were constructed from what would otherwise have been mere aggregations of work people. They claimed that the totality of commitment to the miners' cause was a form of class consciousness, which translated into community consciousness. The book perhaps also include lessons for radicals active in the modern global economy. For they show how socialist activists in the South Wales Miners' Federation led struggles which overcame divisions within a workforce that sprang not only from the British Isles, but from many parts of Europe as well. Portuguese, Germans, French, Belgians, and Spaniards were brought together in the Union alongside English and Welsh speakers with a multiplicity of local dialects and accents. The role of these activists was central to the process whereby communities were formed out of these disparate materials. What is more, there was an important revolutionary voice within the miners' union and the local communities. Francis and Smith point to that South Wales was one of the few areas in Britain where the Communist Party of Great Britain had substantial roots. And the Communist Party in Wales drew on a strong local tradition of Marxism and syndicalism, which expressed classically in the 1912 pamphlet, The Miners' Next Step, that the official union of the official leadership of the trade unions could not be trusted, and that control of the union should be kept as close as possible to the rank and file. This is an important point. Trade unionism, especially as it's institutionalized through trade union bureaucracies, tends to fix and limit working class struggles within rather than within and against capitalism and the state. The tension between local working class organization and trade union leadership thus illuminates an organic tension between tendencies towards socialism alongside conflicts with the limiting parameters of civil society. The militants organized in various revolutionary groups before 1920 and the Communist Party thereafter, despite the hegemony of a left-wing variant of Labourism in the valleys, in the words of one commentator, as a contagious minority which charged the South Wales Labour movement with power, internationalism and colour. The class struggle ideology of these activists meant that these communities were built in opposition to the ideology of community, which the militants saw as a cover for subordination of the workers' needs to the needs of capital. In place of the idea of community, the militants proposed workers' solidarity against both coal owners and the state as their rallying cry. And far from being parochial localists, the militants fought for an internationalist interpretation of the concept workers' solidarity. They acted, one might argue, as Gramscian organic intellectuals, drawing workers together through an ideology of proletarian internationalism. If this ideology was framed by local and national class struggles, it was also fought for by organised militants. And while there was no automatic relationship between the trade union struggles in the pits and the formation of the broader mining communities, neither was there, as MacIntyre's mature critique of Marxism seems to suggest, an unbridgeable gulf between the two processes. The struggle at the coalface was the backdrop against which local activists played leading roles, educating and ordering desires to build communities which MacIntyre claims fostered the virtues. Moreover, many of these communities paraded their internationalism by proudly embracing the purgative term Little Moscow, which had been applied to them by a hostile press. It's unfortunate that despite registering this phenomenon, MacIntyre hasn't allowed it to inform a more sophisticated reassessment of his relationship with Marxism. In Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, he argues that the Marx from whom we should learn is the Marx of the first volume of Capital. Effectively, what the Marx he's talking about is the author of a theory of alienation, but not the theorist of a socialist movement against alienation. A reason for this interpretation can perhaps be drawn from one of the 4 life history exemplars discussed by MacIntyre's in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, C.L.R. James. What's most interesting about James from the perspective of this essay is that his interpretation of Marxism and Leninism in the 1950s and 60s, when he influenced MacIntyre most, was particularly undialectical. This might seem shocking to anyone who's read James and knows his self-proclaimed Hegelianism, but it's true. As part of his reassessment of Trotskyism after the Second World War, specifically after the falsification of Trotsky's predictions about the outcome of the war, James reaffirmed Marx's argument that socialism could only come through the self-emancipation of the working class. This is obviously a fundamentally important point for a kind of non-consequentialist teleology of Marxist teleology. Moreover, he returned to a very idiosyncratic Lenin. He argued that the world had become ripe for the realization of this vision of socialism, the vision of socialism as outlined in Lenin's State and Revolution, because the working class had been so radically transformed since Lenin's day that most of what Lenin had said about the role of a vanguard party had become obsolete. So whereas Lenin had made sharp delineation between party and class as the basis for political intervention by the party within class struggles, James, in his notes on dialectics from 1948, argued that free activity of the working class means the end of capitalism. So the two things are two sides of the same coin. And the growth of this free activity meant the contradiction between party and class is on the way to vanishing. And in England and in America, it will be impossible to distinguish the Revolutionary Party from organised labour. Extending this argument in his 1956 book, Facing Reality, which he co-authored with Grace Lee Boggs and Cornelius Castoriadis, James wrote, "It is from the growing realization that society faces total collapse that has arisen a determination of American workers to take control of total production away from capitalists and into their own hands." Oh, if it was only so simple. MacIntyre's Marxism at the turn of the 1960s, while not identical with James's, very much paralleled this perspective. For instance, MacIntyre's very un-Leninist defense of Leninist politics, freedom and revolution, he combines a formal defense of building a vanguard socialist party with almost complete silence about the activities Lenin saw as being fundamental to political organization. The reason for MacIntyre's silence is evidenced in his rejoinder to left reformism, where he argued that the self-activity of the working class is revolutionary, for it marks a total break both with the economic and political systems of capitalism, which rely upon the passive acceptance of their alienated role by workers. And socialism is self-activity as a total life form, very much a Jamesian interpretation of working class movements. By equating worker self-activity with socialism, both James and MacIntyre securely position socialism as an imminent tendency within capitalism. However, they did so at the expense of an adequate model of the relationship between practice and consciousness within the working class. 1960s Britain can in part be characterized through a unity of a high level of industrial militancy alongside widespread reformist consciousness in the working class. MacIntyre's break with Marxism can be understood as a response to this situation. His imminent model of socialism of workers self-activity seemed to not fit the morally impoverished reality of working class life at the time. Nonetheless, his comments on working class trade unionism, independent rational animals and elsewhere, suggest that this form of moral impoverishment was far less uniform than is suggested by the arguments made in the thesis on Feuerbacher Road Not Taken. This isn't to suggest that MacIntyre's account of social relations within civil societies without foundation. Of course, it's true that these relations are the social basis of alienation. However, a properly Hegelian Marxist analysis of these social relations as totality, such as that outlined in is a method outlined in the introduction to the Grundrisse by Marx, would reveal a more concrete and more contradictory model of civil society, relations in civil society. This condition is important because, as Sean Sayers has pointed out, alienation contra MacIntyre's interpretation of the concept has not only negative but also positive significance. Alienation, quoting Sayers, does not involve the pure negation of human possibilities in the way that moral interpretation implies. On the contrary, a stage of division of alienation is an essential part of the process of human development. It represents the beginning of the process of emancipation through which human beings are gradually freed from the condition of natural immediacy and develop a self-consciousness and freedom. Alienated labour and alienated social relations play an essential role in this process. If alienation fragments and divides humanity into atomized egoists, it also creates the conditions for collective struggles against this alienation, such as those evidenced by the Welsh mining communities. This aspect of alienation is the basis for a response to MacIntyre's charge that Marxism suffers from an ethical deficit. According to MacIntyre in Ethics and the Conflict of Modernity, because Marx condemned abstract moralism, he couldn't appeal to benevolence or generosity when confronted with the problem of a person who believes they have made a satisfactory life for her or himself and for her or his family within the social order of capitalism and imperialism. Neither could he, for obvious reasons, appeal to the contented person's self-interest. Consequently, Marxists presuppose some crude variant of Benthamite utilitarianism, according to which agents will secure their own well-being by acting so as to bring about the greatest happiness to the greatest number. But because Marx had rejected Bentham's philosophy, Marxists tended to fall silent or to change the question. MacIntyre's use of the word presuppose in this argument covers a multitude of sins. It may be true that some Marxists at some moments in history have presupposed something like Benthamite justifications for their actions, but this is certainly neither universally true, nor is it true of the most sophisticated versions of Marxism. In fact, even those Marxists who fail to make explicit the ethical grounds for their actions can be interpreted as having implicit grounds that escape the parameters of MacIntyre's critique. In orientated to workers and struggles, Marxists have striven to link the specific struggles of these groups to broader struggles against capitalist alienation. This project tends to be more or less difficult as the size and intensity of social movements ebb and flow. Moreover, though it's an infinitely difficult task that requires revolutionary phronesis to relate a multiplicity of different movements of different sizes and different levels of militancy, in broad terms, the Marxist approach to politics can easily be stated. Commenting on the opportunistic tendency to reduce social movements to their immediate aims without relating them to the broader struggles, Engels wrote, "The forgetting of the great, the principal considerations for the momentary interests of the day, this struggling and striving for the success of the moment, regardless of later consequences, this sacrifice of the future of the movement for its present may be honestly meant, but is and remains opportunistic, and honest opportunism is perhaps the most dangerous of all." This general approach to revolutionary politics prefigured Lenin's orientation to what Lukács called the actuality of the revolution. As Lenin wrote, it's only by constantly having the ultimate aim in view, only by appraising every step of the movement and every reform from the point of view of the general revolutionary struggle, is it possible to guard the movement against false steps and shameful mistakes. Now, if we follow MacIntyre in discussing the revolutionary potential of the working class, it's easy to dismiss this as a Nietzschean fantasy. More specifically, the future orientation of both Engels's and Lenin's strategic pronouncements can be interpreted as justifying Stalin's jam tomorrow utopianism. And there is a sense in which MacIntyre's mature critique of Marxism can be understood as a generalization of his early criticisms of Stalinist consequentialism. But not all forms of utopianism can be so dismissed. Indeed, MacIntyre self-identifies as a utopianism, however, a utopianism of the present. He argues that the utopianism of those who force Aristotelian questions upon the social order is a utopianism of the present, not a utopianism of the future. Utopianisms of the future have been and are misleading and corrupting because they are always apt to and almost invariably do result in a sacrifice of the present to some imaginary glorious future, one to be brought about by sacrifice of the present. But the present is what we are, and a refusal to sacrifice it has to be accompanied by an insistence that the range of present possibilities is always far greater than the established order is able to allow for. We need, therefore, to acquire a transformative political imagination, one that opens up opportunities for people to do the kinds of things that they hitherto had not believed they were capable of doing. While this is a powerful critique of utopianism of the future, it need not affect Marx's Marxism for two related reasons. First, as MacIntyre recognizes, Stalinism was in crucial respects at odds with Marxism of Lenin, let alone Marx and Engels, writes that in Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity. Second, Marx, Engels, and Lenin had a dialectical understanding of their ultimate goals, which cannot be subsumed into Stalin's distortion of their thought. Ernst Bloch powerfully argued that the ultimate political aims to which Marxists orientate themselves are best conceived not as a utopia of the future, but as lessons generalized from and imminent to workers' struggles from below. Conceived thus, Marxism is not an ideology of would-be Übermensch imposing his ideology on reality, but a concrete utopia, a truly human potential inherent in reality. According to Bloch, Lenin's realism consisted in his ability to root his politics in these imminent tendencies. There is no realism worthy of the name if it abstracts from the strongest elements in reality as an unfinished reality, wrote Bloch. Understood in these terms, there is a unity between the means and ends in the struggle for socialism. In this respect, Lenin's politics reveal him to be a good Hegelian. He recognized not only the spontaneous tendency for bourgeois ideologies to be reproduced in the working class, but also an equally spontaneous tendency towards socialism within the workers' movement. It's this dynamic relationship that forms the basis for a truly Marxist politics. Compared with either MacIntyre's Marxism or his subsequent critique of Marxism, this model includes a more dialectical account of the relationship between militancy and consciousness within the working class. One consequence of this account of the contradictory nature of working class consciousness is that though it can reconceive Marxism as an ethical practice, through it we reconceive Marxism an ethical practice. For like James and MacIntyre, Lenin insisted that an adequate conception of socialist politics must be rooted in the spontaneous movements of workers against capitalism. If this is the imminent basis for the unity of means and ends as a concrete utopia in Marxist thought, he nonetheless insisted that revolutionary politics cannot be reduced to this movement because reformism too is spontaneously reproduced within the working class. From a similar standpoint, Gramsci penned the most philosophically sophisticated account of the social basis for Leninist politics. On the basis of a conception of contradictory nature of working class life within capitalist society, he argued that there would be tensions between the dominant ideology on the one hand and good sense learned by the working class struggles on the other. The active man in the mass has a practical activity, but has no clear theoretical consciousness of this practical activity, wrote Gramsci, which nonetheless involves understanding the world insofar as it transforms it. His theoretical consciousness can be historically in contradiction to his activity. One might say that he has two theoretical consciousness, or one contradictory consciousness, one which is implicit in his activity and which in reality unites him with his fellow workers in the practical transformation of the world, and one superficially explicit or verbal, which he inherits from the past and absorbed uncritically. The existence of good sense across the working class is the rational core of the optimism of James's and MacIntyre's youthful Marxism. Nonetheless, the hegemony of alienation and the manner in which the hegemony is embedded in consciousness through a combination with a good sense to underpin an incoherent common sense suggests that while socialist politics can be rooted in the real movement from below, it can't be reduced to this. Paralleling MacIntyre's claim that virtuous men and women have to live against the cultural grain, Marxist politics is rooted in a tension between alienation and those processes in and through alienation and through which alienation is challenged and mediated. It's a shame that MacIntyre's engagement with Hegel and Marx has never led him to properly grasp the contradictory unity of working class life as simultaneously including self-emancipatory moments that exist as a unity of means and ends to socialism, alongside more limiting movements and their ideas that reflect the alienated nature of civil society. Understood thus, not only could Marxist politics be reconceived as an ethically defensible practice along the lines of something like MacIntyrean practice, that is of being teleological in a
Just a
non-consequential.
couple of minutes left, Paul.
I'm finished now. Last sentence. In a way that opens up the possibility that the product of the social movement to which Marxists orientate could escape the fate of Stalinism, in a way that would demand MacIntyre similarly historicize his one-sidedly anarchistic conception of institutions. Thank you. Sorry that I went on too long.
Great, thanks, Paul.
My apologies.
Not at all. So we have time for some questions. Maybe not as much as we would like, but we still have some time. So yeah.
My apologies.
Oh, good. Caleb?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Very interesting. So I actually had a question about MacIntyre's comments about CLR James. I can actually post it here in the chat because I have a Kindle. So he not only criticizes this concern about utopianism and kind of instrumentalizing morality, but he also makes this point about James here, which I think is interesting, about and basically saying that Marxism had a defective understanding of the human good. And it's interesting, your reading of the review of Geuss and Independent Rational Animals is somewhat selective, right? I mean, in the sense that you focus on these kind of workers' movements, but it seems that MacIntyre's disagreement, maybe his Hegelianism against a Marxist view, is that he's refusing to sort of see all these kind of conflicts as somehow tied to the workers' struggle, right? He wants to see that there's a whole range of kinds of conflicts that people are involved with about various types of goods. Perhaps like in the way Kelvin Knight has kind of stated it with in terms of a conflict between practices and institutions, as opposed to fitting it all within a kind of struggle, right, between labor and capital. So I don't know if you can comment on that.
I'm sorry, Caleb, I lost you for a second. I think my internet did something. So what you're asking about the relationship of other multiplicity of forms of struggles?
Yeah, exactly. So he says that, he says Marxism had a defective understanding of the human good. And as I read this passage on James, he's basically saying, right, James came to appreciate the sort of cultural embeddedness of life. And so his sort of concern about conflict became much more contextualized, as opposed to being between labor and capital, as seeing, much more in terms of, like I said, in terms of practices and institutions or something. I mean, that would be one way of saying it, right? It would be, as opposed to saying it monolithically as being the issue as being the conflict between labor and capital. The insight that MacIntyre ascribes to James is like almost like a reversal from Marx to Hegel. Beyond just seeing things monolithically in terms of capital and labor, he wants to see this in terms of a broader range of human goods.
I think the issue is the question of method within Marxist theory about developing up from the abstract to the concrete that he talks about in the Grundrisse. I think it's a caricature of Marxism to say that it reduces everything, also all social movements, to the class struggle. I mean, what it does is it puts certain things at the heart of its model. Take capital, for instance. Nobody would reduce the climate crisis or the war in the Ukraine to commodity production, but you start with commodity production, then build up the increasingly complex totality. And it's the same sort of relationship in terms of understanding other sorts of social movements than the relationship to each other. It's not about reducing other sorts of social movements. It's about understanding their relationship. When James wrote, which everybody should read, The Black Jacobins in the late 1930s, what he wanted to do, he was, fed up of reading books on as, black slaves as victims, and wanted to write a book on Toussaint, black slaves as fighters and victors who took on the Spanish, British, and French armies one after another and defeated them and won liberty for Haiti. And and then spent 200 years being screwed by the Europeans and then the Americans for their sins. But that was an anti-racist struggle, and he makes it explicit in the 30s, while he's part of the Trotskyist movement, James, that he's linking the questions of class, and he draws direct reference and parallels with the anti-racist movement in South Africa in the 30s at the time. So I don't think it's a question of, it's always a caricature of Marx, that Marx reduces everything to the economic. I mean, MacIntyre quotes Klein's article in the 1994 essay, where he says Marx is not a materialist. What he argues is that Engels was an horrible reductive materialist. Marx is an economic, reduces everything to the economic. And I just don't think anybody who's read any of Marx, just, that just isn't true. It isn't true. But what we need is a complex model of how the totality is reconstructed, and what Marx takes from Hegel in that reconstruction of the totality. And what was happening in the 60s is, after the kind of midnight of the century of the triumph of fascism and Stalinism in the 30s and 40s, is that we're beginning to see the rebirth of a Marxist movement that's beginning to talk about how do we integrate the question of anti-racist movements, women's liberation, etc., gay liberation within the movement. And there has been an attempt to kind of make sense of that over the last 30, 40 years. That's very different, I think, than, for instance, intersectionality politics, which is, it seems to me, to simply be a collection of putting these various different struggles side by side rather than integrating them into a whole. And this then is the attempt that an Hegelian Marxism should, would attempt to do. I mean, the crucial point that I was trying to make in the story was that MacIntyre's Hegelian Marxism wasn't Hegelian enough in the 1950s to understand the contradictory nature. And part of the contradictory nature of civil society is that it leads to reified relationships, including racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., and struggles against that are struggles against capitalism, but in a non-reductive way. Once you start to say things like that, people start to accuse you of reductionism. I don't think the classical Marxists were, really, if that makes sense. Sorry, I'm just getting an abuse from Jeff on my phone at the same time about how grey my hair looks.
I've got a question, Paul. Just to pick up on Taylor's point and some of the things that Jennifer mentioned yesterday in talking about ethics and conflicts of modernity, and one of the richest parts of that book being the final part, and then James is the kind of penultimate kind of example of moral reasoner, and MacIntyre's kind of main way of kind of exemplifying that is not the book that you mentioned, Black Jacobins, which is the one that's most interested in class struggle in terms of the popular books of James's, but Beyond the Boundary, which is kind of has some sociological aspects of class involved in it, but it's much less. Well, I suppose MacIntyre's kind of interest in that particular book is that he sees the kind of the practices in James's own life as a kind of player of cricket, commentator of cricket, and so on. So maybe if you want to say a little bit about that, that would be great. And I have another question, just in terms of, and correct me if I misunderstand your argument, but the kind of part of the kind of mapping out of MacIntyre's 50s work, and especially in his way of thinking in terms of the closest that he gets to Hegel, I see you're arguing is in the kind of notes of moral wilderness, and particularly in his suggestion that if we're going to understand the way that we should understand base metaphor, base superstructure metaphor is by reading Hegel's logic. But it seems to me that this is, I think it is the second part of that's important in terms of how we might understand determination in Marx's work. It's a mediated category. And this is generative, but I wonder whether the base superstructure metaphor is that interesting even in its best possible version, because it's largely unmediated, it's dualistic, more or less, that it kind of doesn't really get us very far. So yeah, those are the two questions I had.
If you start at the beginning, Beyond a Boundary. I mean, if you haven't read Beyond a Boundary, I advise that you do and you buy it for all your friends and family as a Christmas gift. It is quite simply the best sport book ever written, a kind of part autobiographical of James's kind of background in Trinidad, wonderful analysis of the interrelationship between race and class within the empire, James coming to England, and the love of cricket alongside the love of Shakespeare and the justification of some of its weaknesses. I think very much James reifies the ethics of amateurism and the ethics of fair play as they were formulated, which are very much class related ethics within sport. And I mean, one of the interesting things about James in that book is that he recognizes the importance of, for anti-racists, supporting the West Indies as a cricketing team. I'm from Lancashire. There are people here who are Americans. It means nothing to them. Watching cricket in the 1970s, basically meant, if it was easy. It was easier for me as a Lancastrian because we had Clive Lloyd, who played for Lancashire at the time as well, who happened to be the captain of the greatest West Indian cricket team that came over in the 70s and 80s and destroyed the English cricketers at the time. If you were an anti-racist, you supported the West Indies cricket team against the English establishment. And the fact that they came over and began to win those struggles, those competitions in the 60s, and then absolutely dominated the game in the 70s and 80s, was incredibly inspiring for a generation of anti-racists. But at the same time, they did so by becoming a machine, and it is this the way in which sport negates the kind of playfulness of play. Sport is a capitalist form, and this is the point of understanding the totality. Sport is a distortion of play. Don Bradman, the greatest batsman who ever lived, arguably, apparently he describes the one game of cricket where he enjoyed playing cricket, and that was the day he'd scored his 100th century. And after he'd scored the century, he then just started to play and enjoy himself. The rest of the time, it was simply being a machine. Now, I've got kids. I'll give you an aside on this. My daughter happens to be naturally incredibly talented swimmer, and they tried to pull her in. They talent spotted her at school and tried to pull her into the swimming, development of the British kind of swimming strategy. And we were brought into a meeting a couple of years ago at a swimming pool where a 16-year-old girl told us about all the wonders of the exercise regime of getting up at 4 a.m. and doing 4 hours before school every morning and doing this and creating the. And this 16-year-old girl then said in passing, "Oh yes, I have had a hip replacement already because of the amount of exercise." This is abuse. This is child abuse. Psychological report. Sorry, the American Psychological Society did an analysis of why the British did so well at sport in the 2012 Olympics, right? So Britain has punched above its weight in the Olympics since 2012. Why has it been able to do that? And what the Americans looked at is they said, everybody knows how to get good enough to be at the Olympics, to do the 10,000 hours of intense training to get you good enough to that. What's the magic to get you that extra yard? The British worked it out. Do you know what the magic was to get you that extra yard? They find the 10,000 kids who are swimming or whatever it is. And then they find the ones whose mummy died of cancer, whose brother died in a car crash. And they say to them, do it for little Jimmy, do it for your mummy. And that's how they get the extra little edge on them, right? And to not be able to recognize the reified nature of sport, and for James, after he wrote Beyond a Boundary, to really not be able to write about the 1970s team in a critical manner that he had before, because of the way in which sport starts to become reified as a capitalist form, despite the fact that I was on the side of that team, shows, I think, fundamental limitations with his understanding of sport in that book. What does that mean in terms of base and superstructure? It's about understanding the capitalist form, putting the question of the economy at the core of the relationship, this kernel. It is true that everybody and his wife will tell you that the base superstructure is crude, dualistic, etc., etc., etc. But when E.P. Thompson says, actually, MacIntyre's model of it is the way forward, and the author of The Making of the English Working Class is anything but a crude reductive model of that development, we can begin to see that we're capable of maintaining that relation, maintaining an understanding of that relationship that isn't a crude causal, dualistic, etc., etc. relationship, and understanding it in much more Hegelian terms that MacIntyre began to point to in 1958 when he was but a child.
All right, thanks for that, Paul.
Sorry.
Right. No, we're good. Let's just give Paul another round of applause. Okay, great. We might come back at 25 past the hour for Matisse. Great, thanks.